Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Hi, I'm Judy Howard with ARC, and I have with me the presenters for our session on Actuary, which is a credit risk monitoring solution supporting a sustainable payment ecosystem. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. We really appreciate your time as always. And now I'd like to introduce our first guest presenter, who is Paul Van Effelen, co-founder and strategic advisor at Actuary, who has over 25 years of experience in payment and travel industry, supporting both OTAs and airlines. His focus now as a consultant is on creating awareness around the impact of COVID on innovation and regulations on the B2C and B2B travel payment value chain. So he brings with him a lot of experience, so it'll be great to hear from him. We also have Kiana Chiara, who is the Vice President Travel at Mastercard, and she has over 18 years of experience in payment and the travel industry, with a focus on credit issuing, processing, acquiring services, and payment strategic alliances. Again, comes with a whole bunch of experience. And on our side, we have Cornelius Hadding, who's our Director of Revenue Integrity. And Cornelius has a lot of years around the globe in the payment space as well in the travel industry. He will be asking questions to Paul and Kiara throughout this session, so please type any of those in that you may have in the control panel on the side. You will be muted through the entire presentation. So again, we encourage you to ask those questions. Now is the time to ask the experts that we have presenting here today. Okay, Paul, I'm going to be handing it over to you now to get started.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, good afternoon in the US and good evening here in Europe. Welcome to this session. And by the way, you also saw Mr. Martin Alleman there, the CEO of Perseus, who's also joining us today for this session. Welcome, Kiara. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining.
Hello, many thanks, and hello to everyone.
Just see if I can. Here we go. So yeah, the topic for today is a new credit risk monitoring solution that the team at Perseus has developed for initially the airline industry, for airlines and for airline acquirers, but hopefully soon also for other merchants in the travel industry and even outside of that. But Kiara will introduce that in a minute. So my name is Paul van Alphen. I work as a consultant in the travel payment industry. And maybe, Kiara, is there anything else you would like to add to the introduction from Judith?
No, most probably rather than say that it's over most probably now 20 years experience in travel payment. And I also have with me today my colleague, Eliana Sanders, that she will support as well in case there are any questions as well. So thanks as well, Eliana, for being there.
Okay. Okay. So before we dive into the topic, maybe a quick introduction about Actuary. Actuary is a platform that was developed by the team at Perseus, and maybe Cornelius, you've been actively involved with the ARC team on risk check. Can you give us a bit of background on the relationship between Perseus and ARC?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for giving me a minute for that. ARC has been a partner with Perseus for many years and goes even as far back as I think up to 12 years now, and even before I joined ARC. So seriously, a very good relationship has been formed over the years, and of course we've been partnering in a lot of areas of sharing information from especially fraudulent data to Perseus, and also participated in a multitude of global events around risk and fraud management. And one of the initiatives we worked on with Perseus was the ARC Risk Check tool. Now, this was built out of the existing platform of Perseus for risk reviews. However, we felt we needed something for entry-level agents, smaller to mid-sized level agents that can actually come in and do a review of people booking tickets through them and making sure that the people that are utilizing them for their services are actually legitimate individuals and will not generate chargebacks. We came up with the ARC Risk Check, which is that tool that's really specialized and sort of more of a manual environment where people can go and do a one-off check of maybe 5, 10 or so customers coming into their booking environment. But there's also an API connection for that as well. But the tool really just is there to simplify the agent's risk management, but also airlines can utilize this tool as well. And most airlines that do utilize it actually connect via an API. But we've seen some successes with our agency community, especially here in the US, utilizing the tool, feeding information into the tool, and just having the ability to monitor on their end has helped a lot.
Okay. Well, thanks, Cornelius, for that introduction. So before we're going to have a closer look at Actuary, which is basically a sister product of Perseus, I would like to ask Chiara to give us some more background from the scheme perspective on what happened over the last 1.5 years as a result of the pandemic and what kind of impact it has on the way that the scheme works with the acquirers and the merchants, especially from a credit risk perspective. So Chiara, could you take us through that, please?
Yeah, perfect. So as you can see in this slide, the crisis has been unprecedented, specifically, I would say, for the travel industry. And the global recession has been huge. I think that today as an industry, we have definitely one priority, capturing sales. It's key, instill confidence in consumer and evolve or advance the payment business model. What we saw is that the pandemic has exposed and put on the spot few travel payment processes or flows, if you want. One being definitely the B2B payment side, where we saw that legacy B2B payment processes across, if you want, the global travel ecosystem did not work properly. So there was definitely a lack of visibility, predictability of their payment flow, very long settlement periods, so that the travel suppliers definitely did require better protection and also risk monitoring. And that's why what we are seeing here is a transition to virtual cards. And the second is what we are talking today is the relationship between airlines and acquirer. So definitely as a consequence of COVID, acquirers did lose eventually risk appetite on travel merchants, and in some cases even are holding travel merchant back on the path, if you want, to the recovery and the growth. If you go to the next slide, Paul. So what we are seeing here is, so just for you to understand, we call travel merchant usually, we call it deferred delivery merchant, because between the time of the purchase and the time of flying or consuming the services, there is a gap. So it's the deferred delivery merchant, so the service is delivered later on. What we're seeing is that on this with this kind of merchant, that means that the risk exposure usually for the acquirer it is longer because it is still when the service is consumed. Pre-COVID, what we saw as well, that there have been a lot of insolvent carrier. So 23 in 2019, and also as a consequence eventually of few travel merchants going out of business, there was a lot of pain on the acquirer being, I would say, responsible for the payment in the case of the Thomas Cook one, or even acquirers going out of business. Now, during COVID, we saw eventually more challenges because we saw that the merchants were unable to, I would say, fulfill transaction. And they were missing current revenue because they had to refund sales, but new sales were not coming in. So what is key is that on the back, I would say the acquirer, they were not really understanding what was the real risk exposure. And on top, there were all these vouchers coming in. So what we think it is essential for eventually a good recovery between airline and acquirer. And Paul, sorry if you can go to the next one. Yeah. Next slide. Sorry, is really to work together. Okay, and we are trying to facilitate as well this discussion. Definitely, what we saw is that there is a need of, I would say, automation of data between airlines and acquirer. The acquirer need to have the full view of what's going on. And it's not just a matter of high level or a range of exposure. They need to have full visibility on each of the transaction with all related changes and eventually with all related voucher. The acquirer on their side, they have a need of to do a proper and accurate risk monitoring as well. Not to say that they need to work together. I think this is an important relationship. They need to. There should be, I would say, a transparent relationship between the two with clear communication. Also to understand what's going on the customer, or also on the different, also on the airline side. But as well, what we are also seeing now that the airline are forced to onboard new acquirers as well in order to split, if you want, the risk side. And every time there is an onboarding of a new acquirer, there is a lot of work. Of course, for us, it's key as well to support airline and or travel merchant during this process, and that's why we want to work closely with them, but also support in a way the acquirers in order for them to better manage, if you want, the risk, but also to have more acquirer, if you want, entering the travel space. So COVID did accelerate, I would say, few new flows, and I think it is important to stay close and see what is happening next.
Okay, thank you, Chiara, for sharing that from a scheme point of view, and very good to see the commitment from Mastercard to a sustainable and a healthy ecosystem where acquirers and airlines can work together in a transparent way. So part of that working together in a transparent way, I happen to know that Mastercard is also working closely with airlines to basically grow their overall understanding of payments and all the aspects that play a role there. And as part of this session today, I'd like to share a couple of the slides that we typically use for those airline trainings, airline workshops, and to also set the scene, to take it through the process step by step, and then to zoom in on the Actuary platform, and also to show you some of the screens that come from a live demo, actually. So if we go back to the beginning, pre-COVID, managing airline payments was already complex. There are very many variables in the equation. As a payment team on the airline side, and we also see, by the way, that the ownership of payments is also moving more to a centralized role, where, for instance, the direct channel and the indirect channel come together with NDC in the middle. But there are quite a lot of touch points within an airline where payments play a role. And obviously, there is the payment gateway. There are card payments to be accepted, local forms of payment, alternative forms of payment. There is always an important thing to take care of. That's, of course, the risk of fraud, and also to unlock sales from new touch points, from new channels, if it's APIs or if it's sales in flight or at the airport, from kiosks or backdrops. And nowadays, managing payments is really a complicated task. And especially now, due to the unforeseen circumstances around COVID, we also see it on the airline side that resources have been reshuffled or even made redundant, and also the airlines are struggling to keep a full grasp on the payment component. Where maybe before COVID, it was pretty much focused on generating sales, on improving conversion, maybe on reducing cost. I think one of the most important things when COVID happened, when COVID happened was actually that all of a sudden a lot of the processes that, well, were not really working maybe perfectly, but were not broken, so there was no real requirement to fix them. Like Chiara said, processes like the fact that there were more refunds to be processed than sales were coming in. There was a large number of chargebacks coming the way of the airlines. A lot of the back office processes just were not given maybe the priority that they in hindsight should have been given, in a way of automation, for instance. So there was quite a lot of disruption. And one of the things that, as Chiara also mentioned, is that the relationship between acquirers and airlines were put under a lot of pressure. There was a lot of uncertainty. Chiara mentioned the number in 2019. Luckily, due to also the state aid being given, so far not that many airlines have stopped operating, but it was definitely on the top of mind for the acquirers and their credit risk teams to make sure that the risk on the acquiring side was being managed, and that had quite a lot of impact, especially on the relationship between the acquirer and the airlines. If it was about the collateral being held, the funds being withheld, or maybe the maximum volume that was allowed to be processed, the relationship was put under a lot of pressure. And I think one thing became very clear, that historically there was no proper data exchange. To a certain degree, it was done at the time of settlement. So after booking and ticketing, the settlement records were sent to the acquirer, and with that settlement records, also itinerary data was shared about the flights and when they were supposed to take place. But any updates after that were not shared with the acquirer. And pre-COVID, that was not a big deal because it was only maybe a very small percentage. When at the end of Q1 last year, the borders closed, the flights got cancelled, all of a sudden everything went into reverse, and the overall majority of the bookings were cancelled, and all of a sudden that had a huge impact on the amount of funds that the acquirer had already paid out to the airline, but had not been flown yet, and that's the exposure, and we're going to get back to that in a second. I would like to give you some more background on what is credit risk for card payment.
Okay, Paul, can you go back 5 seconds? I think you use your sound went off for about a second.
There's one. Yeah. Okay. I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes. Now, yes.
Wait. You gotta make a change here. Sorry about that.
All technology now.
Can you hear me again?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Let's focus on an important difference here. If you look at the right-hand side of the screen now, you see the clearing settlement flow for a card transaction. There are two major roles here. One is the issuer that has a relationship with the cardholder, and the other one is the acquirer that has a relationship with the airline. And I think it's important to note here that where the issuer is liable for non-payment of the cardholder, so once an authorization is given, independent if the cardholder pays or not, the payment is guaranteed to the airline, to the merchant. So that's their liability. But on the other side, the acquirer, on the acceptance side, is liable in case of non-delivery by the airline. So if the airline stops operating and the service had not been delivered yet and the funds have been handed over to the airline, then that's their challenge. Okay, so I'll just walk you through the process here. So airlines partner with Visa and Mastercard acquirers and schemes to accept prepayments for bookings and ancillaries. So the key word here is prepaid. So it's before the service is actually delivered, and it differs quite a bit between ancillaries and regular bookings. By the way, ancillaries, especially when they are bought at the airport, the kiosk or the check-in desk, are typically delivered right away or the same day, and bookings are typically made anywhere between, in average, 15 and probably 75, 90 days in advance. So there's quite a big gap there. Well, where does the risk come from? Well, the card scheme always protects the card holder in case a product or service not delivered, but the money is already taken, and then the card holder has the right to dispute that transaction, to reverse that transactions, and basically to get their money back. The merchant is liable for all chargebacks due to non-delivery, as long as it's still operating. So as long as it's business as usual, so there's a single flight is not flown, and in the end, a couple of passengers, they reverse their payment, they dispute it. That's just typical processing. It's a negative part of the settlement. It's deducted from the sales, and it's business as usual. The problem starts when a merchant defaults, goes out of business, goes into bankruptcy. Differs a little bit in the US how it works with Chapter 11, but if it stops operating, and we've seen some cases here in Europe that at midnight the website went on black and basically said, if you booked online, don't bother contacting us, contact your card issuer and ask your money back. So that's the worst case scenario for an acquirer. If that happens, then anything that's still in transit is basically at risk, because they will have to pay that back to the scheme, and the scheme will pay it back to the issuer, and the issuer will pay it back to the cardholder. The whole process will be reversed. But what's in the end the risk assessment done by an acquirer, by a Visa Mastercard acquirer, or by American Express, is that they look at two sides of the coin. They will look basically at the financial health of the airline, trying to determine on very many different variables what's the likelihood that that worst case scenario will happen, that bankruptcy or that default will happen. And if that happens, what's the amount that's then in transit? What's the amount at risk of reversal, of being asked back by the cardholders, therefore that the acquirer is responsible for sending that money back. And so that's the amount paid by the airline, not yet fully required. There's, by the way, also chargeback fees for all those tickets and bookings that are being reversed. And to cover that risk, the acquirers impose conditions or collateral. So they will determine what part of the total amount outstanding they would like to cover to feel comfortable. And that's called a collateral or a deposit, and that can be anything from cash amount to, like, for instance, a bank guarantee, but anything that will at least give them the certainty that if this happens, that they can then compensate the money that they have to give back to the scheme and to the issuer with that amount. Overall, I think it's very fair to say that COVID has really disrupted this space and has both sides of the coin. So the overall assessment of the financial health, and bear in mind, for instance, that a lot of airlines received state aids or other forms of support from the local governments, but there were other variables in that equation that really started to change. So that's one important part of the overall risk assessment. And the other part of the coin is then, okay, that amount that's outstanding, how can you first of all calculate it properly, given all the rules in place, for instance, by the schemes and the processes in place, but also then monitor it and preferably also forecast it. So you have also looking forward a good view of what it will look like, and that it's completely transparent, open book calculation between both the acquirer and the airline. Okay, so if we then draw that into a diagram, it looks like this. So when a booking is made, then typically the remittance is done, depending on the agreement with the acquirer, an X number of days later, let's say 3 days or 5 days or 10 days. And then anything that's still, let's say, between that 10 days and the actual departure date, the original departure date, that's then basically the exposure. Because if something happens with the airline in that intermediate period, then the acquirer is at risk, is liable for that particular amount. This is basically the pre-COVID scenario. That was all clear because the overall majority, 99, 98%, of the flights were flown on the original dates. So that was relatively easy to calculate based on the information provided at the time of booking. Well, when COVID hit, something else happened. So, like I mentioned, end of Q1 last year, lots and lots of cancellations, and that triggered a number of things. Refund requests, rebooking requests, vouchers were being issued with as a credit for the flights. Some countries, the local regulators like the DOT in the US, forced the airlines to refund within a certain period. Also, the European Union stepped in to tell the airlines that they had to do that properly according to the rules and regulations in place. But what happened is that the original departure date was in many cases extended. It was first held, then rebooked, and then in a lot of cases, what we've seen is that a new departure date was booked, and then the borders closed again, so it had to be reversed into in a voucher again, and another rebooking was made. But again, according to the setup in place and the fact that you first have to deliver the service to fully get rid of the liability as an acquirer, this became a very difficult situation because it was not clear. And if there's one thing for sure, that is that credit risk people at the acquirers do not like uncertainty. They do not like that they don't know exactly what's going on. So that really impacted their overall appetite to maintain a healthy relationship with their airline customers and to keep on releasing the funds because they didn't really know what their risk was. So that triggered the whole idea to come up with a platform that would actually fill that hole, that would actually report that missing information. First of all, complete original level 2, level 3, the airline itinerary data, but also then any life cycle updates, anything that happened after the original booking to the tickets, so cancellations, rebookings, etc. And the idea for Actuary came just out of that. So that's where Actuary fits in. So what is Actuary? It is basically the Perseus platform, not dealing with, in this case, with fraud screening data, but with credit risk data. And it's basically the airline and the acquirer sharing data. And the platform is then creating, first of all, doing all kind of sanity checks, make sure it's complete and correct. Then creating calculations and determining what exactly the situation is when it comes to the exposure, historic, current, and future, and then sharing that with both the acquirer and the airline. They both have dashboards where they can monitor their exposure and look at the forecast and look at the collateral, what they have, and compare it to what the true exposure is. And that's basically filling that gap. And that's what Martin and the rest of the sales team, myself, have been working on closely with schemes, with acquirers, with airlines to fine-tune it in such a way that it will help the relationship between the acquirer and the airline, and to come to a fully transparent and correct view of it, with data being available on a daily basis instead of, for instance, every quarter or even every half year. So maybe let me pause for a little bit here. Cornelius, do you, by the way, have any questions already coming in, or maybe if you have any questions yourself?
I have maybe one question here that came in. Just trying to understand what other than the risks that you guys just mentioned here, what else would a acquirer look for in wanting to work with an airline? What sort of requirements are there for the airline to fulfill for the acquirers to really look at them and wanting to work with them?
Yeah, I think, and Chiara, please chime in, but I think there's always, of course, the commercial side of it, but that's obvious. I think it will have to do with, are they actually allowed, from a scheme policy perspective, to work with that particular airline? Do they have the right credentials in place to be accepted as an airline acquirer? That's not necessarily a given. As an acquirer, you cannot just start processing for every single airline around the world. So you have to adhere to certain rules, regulations by the schemes. Yeah, there's like, how can the transactions actually end up with the acquirer? So is it technically possible to work together? And there are definitely things around compliance and for instance, the fraud levels need to be under control, obviously, like with other merchants as well. But I think looking back at the last 15 months, yeah, I think the most important step, the most important bridge to cross, if you like, is for the acquirer to get a clear understanding of the financial situation of the expected volumes and to see if they can agree on credit risk terms that are acceptable to both the airline and the acquirer. But maybe, Chiara, if there's something else you would like to add to that?
No, I was just about to add that the payment terms most probably it's what they need to come to, to come to an agreement and an understanding, and can be from an acquiring perspective, I guess, can be different. Can be different options. Most probably the sooner will require I would say a collateral, or eventually the later most probably it will not require it. What most probably it is important eventually to say is that whenever an acquirer is requesting a collateral, we do always, I would say, suggest as well to the different airline to have this money or this collateral in, I would say, in a escrow account, so that they are always the ultimate, I would say, owner of that collateral, just in case, I would say, something happen. I think this is also important.
Yeah. So talking about collateral, and I don't know if this is going to be touched on a little bit later, but by using Actuary, if you have Actuary in your airline and you use Actuary with your acquirer, is there an opportunity there for a reduction in that financial?
Yes. Yeah, well, that's a very good question, by the way, and that's always been the intention of Actuary. Maybe indirectly, because in the end, the platform doesn't decide, on what the airline, the acquirer in the end agrees to, but by creating full transparency, by having all the data and sharing the insights and having an instant, let's say, opportunity to on a daily basis to compare your risk conditions with the true risk and also have the forecast in place. The idea is that by having also this data granularly, right? So you have the bottom up, that from a transaction level bottom up, you have all this data, so it's complete, it's correct. That it would definitely improve the overall confidence levels on the acquirer side, and that they are therefore then willing to reduce their collateral because they can fine-tune it they can follow it much more closely than before. They can follow the seasonality, any disruptions are instantly visible, and even the platform also allows to link actually the true departure date of the first leg or the last leg to the release of the funds, so that from an acquirer perspective, you can follow the delivery basically on a day-to-day basis. And before COVID, before Actuary, that was done more in a much more static way, by having a lump sum, by a fixed amount, or by having an X number of days, and that was maybe adjusted every quarter at best, maybe every half a year or a year, even based on consolidated data. And now you can basically, with the booking information, with the payment information, all the updates being done on a daily basis, you can actually follow that on a very in a very close way, and therefore be much more on top of your risk, and therefore also because you have the certainty that you can adapt and change instantly. I think that's the idea, that it will be much much closer, and otherwise, the acquirers would need to build in much more room in case something would go wrong, and now they can stick to it much closer. I think that's probably the main difference.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that on the control panel of your screen, on the bottom, somewhere in the bottom right, there's the opportunity for you to write in your questions. I am monitoring that, so if you have any additional questions, feel free to type those in there. I am looking at that screen, so please put those questions out for us, and we'll answer them. But at the moment, we're good. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Cornelius. So let's have a look at some of the dashboards of the Actuary platform. And so what you see here is real data from an airline that actually has a quite prominent role in the cross-Atlantic traffic normally outside of the pandemic. And what you see here is basically a snapshot of the current status of their exposure. So what we do with the platform is we basically flag all the transactions with their latest status and put them in a bucket, if you like. We group them together. And on the left-hand side, you see basically the status is there. Now, a booking, a ticket basically can be open. So it's still, the departure date is still in the future. So it's just waiting there to be consumed, if you like. The other scenarios where actually that has already happened, so it's flown, and that could be the first leg, could be the last leg, but in the end, the transaction has been consumed. In case a flight was cancelled, or at least the booking was cancelled, there are a couple of things that can happen. It can be put on hold for a rebooking, but it has happened quite a lot that airlines decided to issue vouchers, either for the full amount or even with an amount on top as an incentive for the customers to take on the voucher. And they also have extended, by the way, the period. And initially, we've seen cases of maybe anywhere between 6 months and 5 years, but I think most airlines started with 1 year, and we also see now that 1 year has passed, and there have not been a lot of opportunity yet to rebook because of all the pandemic still being out there. So now we see, for instance, that some of the airlines, and this particular airline has actually extended their vouchers to 3 years. So that's where you see that quite a lot of them are still out there. Obviously, a lot of the bookings have been refunded as well. Some of them with a bit of push from local governments, like in Canada, but others also needed some time to get their act together, but then we're slowly but surely, recovering and catching up on the refunds. And we see that definitely that a large amount has been refunded over the last 15 months as well. In the end, it's about the so-called dispute window. So the risk for the airline, the acquirer, is that under the card scheme rules, that the cardholder is allowed to go back to the issuer and ask their money back if the service has not been delivered, if they meet the requirements for that. But there are restrictions as well. Both Visa and Mastercard have rules where they say, well, it's not going to end, it's not going to last forever. The main rule is basically that that window is 540 days after the original sale date. But with the bookings being held, being rebooked, maybe to next season or even next year, we see that's also pushing now towards those 540. And for instance, Visa has also a rule that it is 120 days after the original flight date, the original departure date. So although that, for instance, these vouchers are still out there, they can still be used. Technically, the transactions are not not at risk anymore for any liability for the acquirer in case something happens to the airline. And the last category is where, in the end, I think the customer probably was not willing to wait any longer for a refund, and they took the initiative to reverse transaction, and the issuer actually accepted that, and the money was pulled back from the acquirer by the issuer and given back to the cardholder. So the platform basically received data from the airline, any bookings, any changes, etc. Also from the acquirer. Yeah.
One question: how complex is from an airline perspective to send data to Actuary or to the platform?
Sorry, I missed the first part, Kia. Could you please repeat?
Yes, how complex is, or how easy is from an airline perspective, to send data to Actuary?
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, what we've learned over the last year or so is that, also given reduction in resources and obviously many other priorities, that it was really needed to make it as easy as possible for the airline, so not to have to put in any resource that were definitely needed in other areas as well. So what we're doing basically is to make use of existing export formats from revenue accounting platforms, from their PSS, and to automate in such a way with over SSFP. So that's like a nightly file transfer from any updates that have taken place the previous day, and that is pushed towards our platform, and we take care of all the further handling. So we're trying to make it as low threshold as possible for the airlines, and to give them also all the access to the dashboards, to the reports, so that they have full transparency themselves as well, and they can much more proactively now manage their acquirers, because they have all the data as well, and they can also see on a daily basis what their position is. Are they getting close to the volume cap that they have agreed, for instance, with one of their acquirers? And they can also decide to proactively change the routing of transactions to stay within the boundaries of what they have agreed with the acquirers.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay.
Paul, I also got another question in, and I think it's more related to the formulas that you're showing on the screen right now. And the question is more around sort of between the open and flown data tickets. Those are calculated normally on a segment basis. How can the exposure be prorated, or how's that being prorated in the system?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the data comes in on a ticket EMD level, but the payment transaction is typically at like a PNR level or the booking level. So we actually match the booking information at ticket EMD level with the payment transaction that's either at PNR level or at ticket level as well. We keep track of the status on that ticket and EMD level. So that's basically taken into consideration. But I would say that in overall majority of the cases that it might be that let's say out of a booking of 4 that maybe 1 or 2 get refunded, but then the rest is then, let's say, flying at the same date in the future. All that magic is done behind the screen. So maybe Martin, if you would like to add to that, feel free.
We basically have the information per segment as well. So we have the option to calculate the exposure based on the segments, but in most of the cases, it's either done on first or last leg. But we have all options available.
Okay. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Okay, here we go. So moving on, conscious of time as well. Good thing is that we do the questions in between, so we can use the Q&A time for the presentation as well. The second screen that I'd like to share with you is a different screen. It's more a high level, give you a high level indication of how transactions that have been made, how do they move from their original status to their new status. And you can also see the difference, for instance, between last year and the last month and the last 2 years. And by the way, for this particular demo, the airline that we're showing, we have received data from March 2019 to last week. So it gives a full pre-COVID and during COVID situation. And this particular screen is predominantly for visualizing, also together and discussing together with your acquirer. What are the trends? Are we seeing more refunds? What are they? Yeah, when are vouchers being rebooked, and what's the end result of that? So that's to visualize that particular part. And then moving on to the true numbers. So what you see in this particular dashboard is what we call the exposure reduction, and that means that over time towards the future, the reduction will typically reduce, especially when airline would stop operating, and that's typically, if this is a snapshot. Now, if something would happen today, then this would be the current situation. That's where the two colors split, and what would it look like towards the future. And this really gives an idea of what happened in the past. And you see the peak here. That's end of Q1 last year, where in the middle of basically the spring sale, everything stopped. Everything went to reverse. And no new bookings came in, and the refunds were slowly but surely being handed out. So that's where you see the downturn as well. And we've seen that the bookings are going up, and therefore also the exposure as well. If we then look into that into a more detailed mode, you see that the exposure consists basically of open, rebooked, and vouchers. So all of the transactions that have not been closed yet, have not been shut down yet, like with a refund or a chargeback or being flown. And you see that also the difference between the open, the rebooked, and the vouchers. And one of the I think always most interesting views is, especially also from a client perspective, is what's the situation with the vouchers. And here you can also see that they were basically, vouchers have been around for a long time, but not at this massive scale. They were used for individual flights being canceled, or maybe people being bumped, due to overbooking, something like that. But at the end of Q1, they were issued at the massive scale. And although not many have been redeemed yet, because there's not been a lot of opportunities to fly, you do see the impact here that over time, and although that for this particular airline, the vouchers have been extended to 3 years, that purely from a exposure perspective, the rules also kick in from Visa and Mastercard that will then, although they're still, as long as the airlines are operating, they can still be used. Technically from an exposure perspective for the acquirer, they don't play a role anymore. That's where you see where they flatten out here at the end. I already touched on these rules, and I think that's something that has become quite a topic for acquirers as well. And that was probably one of the problems with the pre-COVID situation, where these kind of calculations were done on a very high level, that the impact of these rules was not completely clear. And as you can see from the numbers, for an airline, it's quite a relief that due to these rules, quite a significant chunk of the exposure is basically taken out, and that will give them, for instance, room to start processing more volume or to reduce the collateral. So by being very complete and correct and having all these rules into the calculation, that should also contribute to overall, a better amount or a better relationship between the acquirer and the airline, because there's no room for confusion, there's no room for uncertainty, because it's all out there, it's all bottom up, complete and correct. Well, there are a couple of other items that I might not have touched on yet. I think I mentioned about remittance, that it is possible now to really connect the status of the booking, so the fact that it's flown to the remittance, and really follow the flights being done, instead of having a fixed, rigid kind of approach to it. You can make it completely dynamic. It will, both on the acquirer side, definitely also on the airline side, save costs, because now the airlines are basically pushed, to reinvent the wheel themselves, to put a lot of manual labor and a lot of effort into it to produce these numbers, not only for their acquirer, by the way, but also for internal, for accounting and audit purposes. It will help them also to forecast the exposure and to already look into what the volume is going to do, what's the exposure of that is going to do over the next 3, 6, 9 months, and how to then streamline the strategy towards multiple acquirers. We touched on transparency, and yeah, I think what's very important here as well is that with per se as an actuary, you have a trusted third party in the middle, basically meaning an independent party that acts as kind of a repository of the data and does all the calculations, has basically working closely together with schemes, with acquirers, with airlines, with stakeholders in the industry, and making sure that we basically help the industry to come through this difficult period and to ensure that over time there will be a healthy marketplace, that there is sufficient supply to meet the growing demand, and not basically put the airlines, well, in some cases leaving them without an acquirer in certain channels, in other cases that they really are in a difficult position when it comes to commercials, to credit risk conditions, to working relationships, and to make sure that this very important topic, credit risk, is basically completely taken care of, that is completely transparent, and that that can help the relationship of the airline with the acquirer. That was in a nutshell, credit risk for airlines and the tool that we have come up with, and that ARC was so kind to let us share with you as airline community under the ARC flag. So, Monsieur Cornelius, is there any more questions, or maybe Chiara, is there anything else you would like to add from a Mastercard perspective?
Paul, I have one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Cornelius.
No, I think one of the questions out there is what is the cost of actuary, and how does that charged, and how does that all work? How does that all tie together there?
Yeah, well, I'll maybe Chiara probably has also a view on that, but it's been our objective to not only from let's say an effort perspective, development work, project-related work, etc., but also from external cost perspective, to keep it basically free for the airlines, and to work closely with the acquirers. It's also very important for them, in their main interest, to make sure that they have, both from a commercial, from a credit risk perspective, a good proposition. So we work directly with the acquirers, basically, and to help them also to keep their relationship with their airlines on a proper level. So we expect some collaboration. Obviously, the data needs to be provided. There's some work in making sure that the numbers add up, and that everything is clear for all parties involved. But there's no direct price tag, at least for the airlines, for Actuary. That's in the domain of the acquirers, and even maybe Chiara a little bit on the scheme as well, because I think for the scheme there's also definitely an interest in making sure that the overall ecosystem stays in place and is healthy, right?
No, I think this solution is great, I would say, for the acquirer that are willing to enter, I would say, the travel space, because I don't think they have to invest on their own on the platform. And is one of the main barriers if you want to acquire when they want to onboard eventually travel merchant, because in the reality today, the majority of acquirers are not doing, I would say, travel because of the specificity of the risk assessment, if you want. So I think the tool like this, I hope that will aim, I would say, will facilitate the entrance of new acquirer in travel that will benefit as well, I would say, on the airline side, on the pricing eventually. So I really see a great tool for the industry.
Yeah. So I mean, building on that, I think is that you've got this as a risk management prevention tool between the airline and the acquirer. However, a lot of failure happens at the travel agency side. Is there anything here that can help an airline identify agencies and risks related to agencies as well? Is that something that's being looked at?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I must admit that we've been talking to so many stakeholders in the industry for the last 9 to 12 months, and every time we noticed that there were other use cases, new ideas, or other innovative ways to basically leverage the data. I think we really touched on something that was missing, and although we're now mainly looking at anything, well, by the way, it's anything with where there is a a deferred delivery liability. So yes, cards, but could also apply to the likes of, for instance, PayPal or other wallets, but also, for instance, what's now very I would say popular also in the US, buy now, pay later, where also those companies still take on a liability that if they pay out the airline, on day 2, and then the customer pays them over time, they also have a challenge if in the end the service is not delivered. So I think there are definitely other areas as well. And coming back to your question, and Chiara, this is also your domain, but on the B2B side, there's of course the acquirer perspective where the airlines merchant of record, but there's also the perspective where in case of BSP or ARC where there's no card involved, but it's so-called cash, that if the airline delivers the service, or even the rules of IATA, they are mandated to deliver the service if the ticket is issued. But if in the end the travel agency is not paying, as part of the settlement, that they also go out of pocket at least for a significant amount of time, and also for probably a large part of it. And that's something where there's a lot of overlap there. I think we can definitely look into how we can bring that data together and also add even more value to the platform for the airline, so that it also makes it even a better choice to adopt it and use it not only for one acquirer, for multiple acquirers, for other schemes, for other products, but also to keep an eye on the risk that they have with potential non-payment of travel agencies for their cash sales.
Paul, if I may add, and we are currently discussing with ARC to see how we can bring also the ARC data into the platform and facilitate this.
Okay. So work in progress, Cornelius.
Yes.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you. I have one other question here, and that is, do you foresee that actuary is going to be a requirement in the time to come from a acquirer? So do you think the acquirers might require an airline to have actuary as a tool to qualify with them?
Acquirer level, definitely. Scheme level, I'll ask Chiara to respond to that in a second. But no, I think we've seen already with the acquirers that use the platform that if they have reached a certain threshold in their overall company-wide risk appetite, and that in order to keep on onboarding new airlines, and unfortunately we've seen, of course, next to the reduction appetite due to the pandemic, also the collapse of a major player called Wirecard in this space, and that meant that quite a lot of airlines were basically looking for either to replace their only acquirer, or to have to find a secondary or tertiary acquirer. And it's not like that there is an enormous amount of acquirers, number of acquirers out there that's willing to jump on that. So the ones that were already active in the space are now also using the platform to make sure that they can still onboard new airlines and with conditions that work for both the airline and the acquirer. So for them, in some cases, it's mandatory because that's the only way for them to accept it. But from a scheme perspective, Chiara?
I would say not for the time being, but definitely I would reinforce what you were saying most probably from an acquirer perspective. Yes, because it's it's something that they should have access to today already, and they don't have, because they don't have their own, I would say, platform. So most probably, will be something that they would request in the future.
All right, perfect. Yep, we're right on time. So I'll hand over to Judy.
Great, thanks Cornelius, and thanks for being our behind the scenes, asking all these great questions to our guest presenters. But a real big thank you to Paul and Kiera. Great information. And as you put up on the screen here, Paul, here is the contact information for anyone that is listening today. Please reach out if you do have any questions. We'll leave this up for just a moment while we do close out. And I just want to make sure, Paul, do you have any closing remarks, or Kiana as well?
Yeah, maybe just follow up on what you just said. You know, if this is a big topic for your airline and you're struggling, you know, with your acquirer relationships, either to maintain them or to build them, you know, ask your acquirer, or even the acquirer that you're hoping to start off with on a new track, to contact us, and we can help, you know, to smoothen, basically to grease the wheels, to smoothen it, to help the onboarding, both the onboarding and the monitoring, to keep the conditions, you know, to the bare minimum. So yeah, that's maybe a final word from me.
Great. Kiera, anything on your end that you would like to say?
No, I think it was great as well for me to be here. And
okay, great. Great. And also I want to say this will be recorded. This will be on our website. And if anyone wants it a little sooner, please reach out. My email, jhoward@artcorp.com. And of course, we welcome any of your questions as always. One other just housekeeping, we do have our fraud month coming up in September, so look for more information to come on that. You'll see a lot more Cornelius during that month, and we'll also have guest presenters then. So look for more information from ARC to come. But again, thank you, Paul, thank you, Kiana, and thank you, Cornelius, as well. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and thank you for attending. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.